Okay, I think we should probably begin. People will probably also filter in once we're underway. That's life. My name is Samir Gandesha, and I'm an associate professor here in the Department of Humanities. I'm also the director of the Institute for the Humanities, which was one of the sponsors of the talk tonight. Do I have a list of sponsors?
Oh, I do.
You have it?
Yeah.
Clint will thank the sponsors. Okay, great. Yeah, I'm just going to say a couple of things. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'd just also like to mention a couple of things about what we're up to here at the Institute. There's a lot going on. This has probably been the busiest week we've ever had. It's just been, rather overwhelming. One of the things that's made it somewhat overwhelming is that we launched our free school entitled Spectre of Fascism, and that is going from now through to July. And we have people continually contacting us and asking if they can do a lecture. It's very much in the style of an extended teach-in, and people really want to address the issue, and so there's a high demand to be put on the roster. So this free school could continue indefinitely. So we'll see. But just the details about it. It's Thursday nights at Unit Pit Projects, which is down in East Pender, just basically East Pender in Maine. Starts at 7 o'clock. The first half of the evening, discussion, question, answer, so on, like lecture, discussion period. And then the second half will be music, drinks, cash bar. It's very, in a sense, stripped down and no nonsense, but it was a lot of fun last night. We got it underway. And the really special thing about it is that Unit Pit Projects are trying as best as they can, and boy, if yesterday is any indication, they do a great job. They're going to curate music specifically to each talk on a given evening, right? On a given Thursday. So please come on down and check it out. I think it's going to be a great way to bring people together and have some serious discussions, but also have some serious fun. So that's happening, and it's going to lead into a conference that we're hosting April 6th to the 9th on its Spectacle of Fascism, which means it is a conference really about the legacy of the SI, the Situationist International, 2 anniversaries of the publication of Society of Spectacle and Revolution of Everyday Life. They're both 50th anniversaries of the publication of those books. So I think that'll be a lot of fun, and we'll have information up very shortly about that. Clint is even giving a talk in that conference. So I think it's going to be good. So that's going on. Last couple of things at the end of March, on March 30th, William Walters is going to be here speaking about the art of disappearance, and then the next day, I think a fascinating looking conference on the violence of detention. So please keep your eyes open for that. The information is pretty much up there on our website. It's on our social media, etc. You'll be able to find it easily enough. So without any further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague Clint Burnham, who will introduce our speaker for this evening. So Clint, over to you.
Thanks, Samir. Just in terms of our sponsors, I'd like to acknowledge the financial support of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Quick Response, Many Email Speakers Fund, the Center for Global and Political Economy, the Department of English Graduate Program, and the Faculty of Communication, FCAT, whatever that stands for, Faculty of Communications, Technology. Okay, sorry. And also in terms of the other events coming up here, 2 weeks from today, Patricia Barkakis and Sarah Hunt will be giving a talk on truth and reconciliation, and truth before reconciliation, and the registration for that event opened today, so you should go to the Humanities website to register for that. It's going to be crazy packed as well. Alberto hates long-winded introductions, so just Google him. But author of Fanaticism.
Not now.
Not now. No Googling right now. And also with Jeff Kinkle, Cartographies of the Absolute. He's been giving some amazing series of talks at SFU over the past month. A seminar 3 weeks ago, a book launch we did together, a visit to my class on Monday, and it's been quite amazing. But I do want to just insert a little bit, take advantage of Alberto's workerist tendencies, and mention, if those of you who may not be aware of, a labor situation right now at Simon Fraser University where 160 cafeteria workers have been given layoff notices by Chartwells, who runs all the food services. They're negotiating new contracts, so it's been pretty ugly. There was a demo today at 3 o'clock, and there's a petition online at change.org. So it's really terrible how our university is treating our actual staff, our actual workers. So please take some action with regard to that. But I just want to turn over the mic and the evening to Alberto and let him get on with his talk. Thanks very much, and welcome to Vancouver.
So thanks so much to Clint, to Samir, and to the Institute for the very generous hosting and invitation, and to all of you for coming. So I wanted to start this talk. I'll return to that image at the very end, or towards the very end, and perhaps explain why it's there. But first I wanted to begin with two epigrams that in a sense orient the comments I'll be making, there we go. The first is from the historian of political ideas, of political thought, J.G.A. Pocock, from the 4th volume of his fascinating Barbarism and Religion, a study of the sources of Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This 4th volume is called Barbarian Savages and Empires, and explores the nature of those concepts across, especially the 18th century Enlightenment. And he writes there, savages were invented in the old world but encountered in the new. And I suppose the talk is an attempt to unpack that idea. The second one is from French anthropologist, radical French anthropologist Pierre Clastres, very well known for the book Society Against the State, from which essay Copernicus and the Savages, this quote is taken. He writes, "It is imperative to accept the idea that negation does not signify nothingness, that when the mirror does not reflect our own likeness, it does not prove there is nothing to perceive." And most of the talk, as the title, By Contraries Execute All Things, which is taken from Shakespeare Tempest, most of the talk is in a sense trying to explore this link between the Western invention of the figure of the savage as a key element of political and historical thought, and this question of negation or negativity. In what sense is the savage perceived as the negation of the civilized, and what might that mean both for the history of philosophy and in some sense for the present? Partly because I want to get through a lot of material. I'll read this out because if I ad-libbed, I'd get to about 10%, so hopefully it won't be too forbidding. The call to decolonize philosophy demands, among other things, a preliminary assessment of the shaping power of the colonial relation across that discipline's history. Such an inquiry will involve an excavation of how the European encounter with and exploitation of other peoples condition the different forms taken by what Etienne Balibar has called the problem of anthropological difference. My concern tonight is to explore how philosophers adapted, and transformed, and in a sense invented, the figure of the savage from the late 16th century to the late 18th century as the kind of living negation or inverted image of civilized Western humanity. Now, while the paper might seem, for its rather perhaps overwhelming wealth of quotes and the like, to be some exercise in fabulous erudition, I want to give a sort of disclaimer that this is a very second-hand erudition. So I'm very much working on the basis of especially two Italian texts published in the 1970s by historians of philosophy, Sergio Landucci's Philosophers and Savages, and Giuliano Liozzi, Adam and the New World, as well as a whole set of works within the English-speaking world, from Anthony Pagnon to Olive Dickinson and others. So from Horkheimer and Adorno's location of anti-Semitism within the dialectic of Enlightenment, Said's Orientalism, from de Beauvoir's The Second Sex to Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, the critical history of Western philosophy and rationality has abounded in explorations of the intimate, if often obscured, bonds between the speculative subjection of otherness and its social or material counterparts. Now, the blatantly instrumental character of the idea of the savage to the colonial project, from the Spanish conquest to the ongoing dispossession of indigenous people across the globe, would appear to argue against any sustained or particularly nuanced exploration of this term. So it seemed to be so stark in its denigration of entire peoples for the sole purpose of justifying plunder that in some sense one might ask why even bother to sift through the annals of so-called Western civilization to get greater bearings on this. And hopefully, just hopefully, the exercise will prove worthwhile. In what follows, I want to propose that contrary to the justifiable reflex that we're just dealing with a kind of stark racist and legitimizing trope, there's much to be gained in an investigation of the uses to which the idea of the savage was put by European thinkers in the crucible of colonial modernity. The uses might perhaps be principally for a kind of political history of philosophy itself, but also, maybe, for a grasp of the current and contradictory endurance of colonial imaginaries. The idea of the savage played a critical role in the emergence of modern political philosophy and the subsequent unfolding of the ideologies of progress and the correlated sciences of development, classical political economy, anthropology, sociology, and so on. In the period of this intellectual ferment, broadly the late 16th to late 18th century, in a Europe racked by inner turmoil and external conquest, which is to say in the midst of the throes of the emergence, colonial emergence of a capitalist world from the matrix of Christian feudalism, the savage, in philosophical writings, was imagined, as most of you I'm sure probably have come across already, with reference to the encounter with the indigenous people of South and North America. But especially, and this is, I suppose, the somewhat more locally oriented aspect of my talk, especially with what at the time, with reference to what at the time were already being referred to, and I'm talking about the 17th and 18th century, as Canadians. As Pocock has observed, the Americas became a, quote, vast laboratory in which European speculative experimenters tested their hypotheses regarding the human mind. The first philosophical appearance of these Canadians, and that's Canadien, most of this is French philosophy I'm talking about, but also German, and some of this would have been written in Latin, of course. The first philosophical appearance seems to have come with a debate among supporters and objectors to Descartes' philosophy, specifically in the second objections to Descartes' justly famous meditation. So the very text that's supposed to count as the origin text of modern European philosophy has, amongst its objections, a reference to the indigenous peoples of North America, specifically to Canadians, in a counter-argument to Descartes. And the debate is mainly around the innateness of the idea of God's infinity, which of course plays a crucial role in Descartes' argument. The engineer and physicist Pierre Petit, in one of his objections to Descartes, argued that the absence of this idea, of the monotheistic idea of an infinite God, among the indigenous people encountered by French colonists in the early to mid 17th century was proof of the falsity of Descartes' arguments. And Descartes took much trouble to argue why this was not the case. So this view appeared in the 1641 second objection to the Meditations. Canadian philosophy, as you can see there in Latin, De Philosophia Canadensium, Canadian philosophy as a locution actually appears in 1707. In the inaugural lecture of a by now possibly justly obscure German philosopher and professor called Jonas Conrad Schramm, who was responding to the writings of the French soldier, adventurer, philosopher, and intellectual, the Baron de la Hontan, from whose book the frontispiece at the beginning of the talk came. Schramm speaks or writes in this inaugural lecture, which, again, secondhand erudition, I haven't myself read. He speaks, paraphrasing Aristotle, on the origins of Greek philosophy, of the stammering philosophy, so that's the balbutiente, stammering philosophy of the native peoples of so-called New France. Jacob Brooker's 5-volume critical history of philosophy from 1742 to 44, apparently a crucial text for establishing the history of the discipline in Europe, would also include a lengthy entry on the philosophy of the Canadians, as would Diderot's encyclopedia, which presented the sort of natural religion of the indigenous populations encountered by French colonists as a kind of correlate to the philosophy of deism that was being counterposed to official Christian doctrines at the time. So what kind of other is the savage? At first, and perhaps second and third glance as well, the savage seems to differ from the others that have so magnetized 20th century critical thought, lacking the unsettling subversive qualities which reason's confrontation with alterity is often deemed to have. In his suppressed 1961 preface to the History of Madness, Michel Foucault envisaged what he called a history of limits, a philosophical history that would interrogate a culture from the vantage point of its outside, the vantage point of its exterior, a vantage point with Foucault taken to task for this by Jacques Derrida in a famous debate, accepted was in a sense an impossible vantage point. He spoke of this as a hollowed out void or a tear by means of which a culture isolates itself and which identifies it as clearly as its value. So it's this expulsion or foreclosure of its other, its limit that, in a sense, for Foucault, defined a culture even more than what it avowed as its own beliefs. Foucault drew here on Friedrich Nietzsche's identification of the origin of Western metaphysics in the forgetting of the experience of the tragic. But he also spoke as examples of this limit or this exterior, of dreaming or the unconscious, and of the whole debate around the Orient. These were all, according to Foucault, and this is his formulation, limit experiences of the Western world, which, he continues, at the frontiers of our culture, trace a limit that is simultaneously an original division. Reflecting recently on the articulation of difference, otherness, and exclusion in the phenomenon of racism, Etienne Balibar, in dialogue with Edward Said's Orientalism, presents this notion of Orientalism as a paradigmatic study of something like an essential or otherness. And that's, in a sense, part of the suggestion already in Foucault's earlier text, that the Orient would be a kind of essential other, an other that constitutively defines how the West sees itself. This is an other who, in Balibar's formulation, is not only an adversary, but embodies a negation of one's moral and aesthetic and intellectual values, an other who, at the same time, in the most contradictory manner, has to be constructed as a passive object of representation, study, dissections, classifications, and an active subject of threats, or simply of an alternative path to civilization and salvation. This is a kind of imminent and constitutive alterity. So thinking of this suggestion by Balibar that there would be essential others, we might ask whether the savage, as conceived by European philosophers from the 16th century, late 16th century onwards, represents such an alterity. Is it, to continue with Balibar, the construction of the other as a kind of alienated self? whereby the self would be nothing but, in Balibar's rather dialectical formulation, the other's other. So you would only be able to figure out what the European self would be as the negation of its own negation, so to speak. I think the answer, or the response to whether the savage as conceived of by European philosophers in this period is a kind of essential other is indeed a mixed one. On the one hand, as I hope to detail below, the savage is in some sense the perfect other, or like the other. The product of a matrix or accumulation of negation. He is exactly what we or the civilized or the Europeans are not. So it would seem to be, in a sense, the kind of most consummate form of this essential alterity. On the other hand, however, largely because of how formalistic this idea that the savage is the negation of the civilized proves to be, a negation which is at the best a kind of ironic reversal of the values of so-called civilization, or a source of skepticism towards civilization, as it might be in figures like Montaigne. The savage as other does not generate the kind of limit experience, the kind of unsettling of Western reason that one might have located in the figures of, for Foucault, the dream and the Orient. In a sense, the starkness of the negation, the idea of the savage as the not civilized, in many, not necessarily all, but in many of these texts, turns it into a seemingly innocuous figure, and that's partly what I wanted to explore. Sergio Landucci, in his book Philosophers and Savages, 1580-1780, has observed that perhaps the savage is really what he calls, using this curious term from alchemical practices, the caput mortuum in Latin, or the dead head. The caput mortuum is the material, the sterile material left in the crucible after all of the work of alchemy. So saying basically, what is the savage for the European philosopher? Once you've gone through all the negation, the savage has no property, no law, no elaborate forms of warfare, no state, etc. There is nothing left that would have any kind of positivity. So it's in a sense a purely negative figure. As Landucci explores with daunting erudition, and Ter Ellingson has amply corroborated in his compelling critique of anthropology's racial legacies, the myth of the noble savage, the figure of the savage is a product of what Ellingson calls comparative negation. So you engage in it only emerges out of the comparison with a certain image of Western civilization, and it's both the product of the activity of comparison, but the comparison is only reduced to the savage being not a number of features or qualities that are ascribed to the civilized. Landucci starts the periodization in his book, hence the date 1580, the periodization of philosophy's invention of the savage, and it's important that it's philosophies, because of course, as we'll touch on, writings by travelers and colonists were of course already using this term, and Spanish theologians, jurists, and so on were engaging in this. Landucci's focused just on philosophy as a discipline. He uses the term 1580 to mark the writing, the publication of Montaigne's famous essay on cannibals, which is viewed in a lot of these histories as being a very formative text for the circulation of this term and this notion through European philosophy. In John Florio's early 17th century translation, which, as I'll touch on in a moment, was the one that Shakespeare read and borrowed from, Montaigne includes the following lines referring to the native populations encountered by French colonists and missionaries in Brazil. And that, incidentally, is particularly bizarre engraving, more or less contemporaneous with Montaigne, and indeed drawing from the same sources. Léry's accounts of his travels in Brazil of what now I guess would be the Tupinamba practices of anthropophagy or cannibalism. Montaigne writes, "It is a nation, would I answer Plato?" So he's talking about he's referring to, obviously, the key text for Western conceptions of the political. "It is a nation, would I answer Plato, that hath no kind of traffic, no knowledge of letters, no intelligence of numbers, no name of magistrate, nor of politic superiority, no use of service or riches or of poverty, no contracts, no successions, no dividences, no occupation but idle, no respect of kindred but common, no apparel but natural, no manuring of lands, no use of wine, corn, or metal." In Montaigne, this logic of negation or of privation was intended famously to frame the radical diversity, the radical difference, the supposedly estranging and positively estranging difference that he identified as part of human nature, and to skeptically puncture the superior pride of the civilized or of the Europeans. The aim of the essay famously was to relativize the category of barbarism. At one point he famously said, well, they might be barbarian compared to the standards of rationality, but they're certainly not barbarian compared to what goes on in Europe. And then famous lines like, well, they eat other human beings dead, we just happen to eat them alive, so we're worse, talking about the particular practices of war and so on and so forth. And he also, starting, I guess, these debates about the figure of, in a sense, the problematic figure of the noble savage, he proposes that the indigenous populations of Brazil, and indeed the cannibals, have a greater closeness to nature, which allows him to condemn what he calls the bastardizing effects of the artificial customs of so-called civilized people. To use a term that Foucault employs for Erasmus's analogous in praise of folly, this was an ironic rather than a tragic critique of Western politics and rationality. Relying, by Montaigne's own telling, on a naive and thus more reliable witness, Montaigne would then be able to fill in the framework of otherness or difference by negation with the description of forms of life. So he moves from this stark negation, no traffic, no money, et cetera, to a more detailed description of what he draws from Léry's accounts. To show that these practices or these forms of life were incommensurate or radically different enough from our own to undermine the dominant doctrines that define something like a universalizing political anthropology of the Middle Ages. The Christian notion of a consensum gentium, or a consensum of a universal consensus, and Aristotle's vision of man as a political animal. So there's a challenge to some of the main planks, including with the direct mention of Plato, of the Western political tradition. The uses and effects of Montaigne's Savage, in which negation and difference heralded a skeptical and ironic suspension of Europe's divisive confidence in its own superiority, were sui generis, and his effort at a dispassionate description of indigenous ways of life, in a sense unique, the fact that they weren't aimed actually at disparaging or treating it as a purely negative figure, the logic of comparative negation was not. So in a sense, there's something quite unique about the purposes, the ironic or skeptical purposes of Montaigne's way of trying to suspend the certainties of a conception of civilization. But this logic of negation was not at all, in a sense, original to Montaigne. In one of the very first travel narratives from the New World, a famous letter to his patron Lorenzo de' Medici, Amerigo Vespucci, who in one of those bizarre accidents of history is, of course, the source of the name of this continent and the one south of it, first put there by a German cartographer in the early 16th century, America. Amerigo Vespucci, in this letter to Lorenzo de' Medici, is one of the first kind of key accounts of these travels in South America, writes, quite similarly, one could argue, and of course it precedes Montaigne, they have no cloth either of wool, linen, or cotton, since they need it not, neither do they have goods of their own, but all things are held in common. This is, of course, one of the recurrent perhaps the key element of this image of negation. They do not have property, whose positive reversal is a kind of what would then later be called primitive communism. They live together without king, without government, and each is his own master. And so on and so forth. I won't read the entire quotes. Nor, and then of course the question of capitalism, there are no merchants among their number, nor is there barter. In 1505, a version of Vespucci's privative description would caption what apparently is one of the first, or if not the first, European visual image of the indigenous populations of the Americas. This is a woodcut, I think, from 1505, which apparently was then rediscovered in the 19th century. In 1511, Peter Martyr d'Angheria, in another landmark text for the European perception of the indigenous people of the Americas, would write in similar terms, land is as common as the sun and water, mine and thine, this refrain again is constant, mine and thine, the seeds of all mischief, have no place with them, a few things content them, and so on and so forth. And actually in Peter Martyr d'Angheria, you'll see that one of the mythical utopian element of this otherwise primitive thinking of the savage is present, which is the whole return of this ancient figure of the Golden Age. They seem to live in that golden world of which old writers, as in ancient Greek and Roman writers, speak so much. As Margaret Hodgin has shown in a fascinating essay about Montaigne and Shakespeare, citing these and other examples from the early 16th century, passages such as this, so these lists, they have not this, they have not that, and so on and so forth, formed what she calls conventionalized statements. They're actually not unique to any one author, and they are not unique to any one philosophical orientation. The barbarous or savage other was defined by the privation of the innumerable, the listable elements of Western civilization: law, property, sovereign power, the mechanical arts, agriculture, mathematics, writing, the cooking of livestock or what have you. You could go on and on and on. As Stephen Greenblatt remarked in his perceptive study of what he calls linguistic colonialism, I quote, the mention of the nakedness of the Indians is typical. To a ruling class obsessed with the symbolism of dress, the Indians' physical appearance was a token of a cultural void. In the eyes of the Europeans, the Indians were culturally naked. This illusion that the inhabitants of the New World are essentially without a culture of their own is both early and remarkably persistent, even in the face of overwhelming contradictory evidence. And much of the whole history that I'm telling is, of course, the history of the systematic ignoring of that evidence. The framing division between what Aristotle, and more recently reinterpreted by Giorgio Agamben, called bios and zoe, or political life and bare life, was manifest here in all its raw literalism. So this particular convention, the negative itemizing of difference, is nigh on ubiquitous from the 16th century onwards and can be registered across travelers' chronicles, in Enlightenment encyclopedias and dictionaries, the entries on Savage and Diderot's encyclopedia and the Dictionary of the Académie Française, in Kant's anthropology, in Darwin's voyages, and in the longer version of this, there's just some endless amount of completely monotonous quotes. To take just one striking example, though, again, to have some, so to speak, local fare, not so immediately local, but nevertheless, from the Franciscan missionary Louis Anpin's Nouveau Voyage d'un pays plus grand que l'Europe, where this particularly dyspeptic missionary writes the following in one of the more aggressive versions of this logic of comparative negation. The apostolic man, or missionary, this is obviously in an English translation of the French text, ought much more to acknowledge this dependence upon the sovereign Lord in respect of those barbarous nations who have not any regard of any religion, true or false, who live without rule, without order, without law, without God, without worship, where reason is buried in matter and incapable of reasoning the most common things of religion and faith. Such are the people of Canada. They live without any subordination, without laws or any form of government or policy. They are stupid in matters of religion, subtle and crafty in the worldly concerns, but excessively superstitious. So the whole racial fantasy of these negations is obviously carried forth here. Just to give you an idea of the depths plumbed by this logic, there's even texts which argue that the reason why the indigenous populations of Canada had ni loi, ni foi, ni roi, or neither faith, nor law, nor king, is because they actually lack the letters F, R, and L. So this, this gives you a sense of how deep this sense goes. They could not have a king because they did not have the letter R. So missing from Hennepin's list of negation, however, is a leitmotif in many of the others, which I've touched on already in the formulation neither mine nor thine, which is, I guess, the kind of utopian element of the negativity, which is to say that the savages knew no property, that they were peoples without property, which is in part a kind of obsession of these accounts. However, as Hodgin has noted, there's nothing particularly modern about this ethnocentric logic of contrast with the other. Another who only exists as an absence or negative of the self. She encounters it in 12th century accounts of the Brahmin of India, described as having in the Roman d'Alexandre no agriculture, no iron, no building, no fire, no bread, no wine, no clothing, nor anything pertaining to the productive arts or pleasure. In the 1st century BC, Latin writers would speak of Scythians as knowing nothing about the storing of food, and Homer would talk about so-called barbarians to the Greeks before as those who by no means spend their lives on contracts and money-getting, but actually possess all things in common. This monotony of comparative negation is no surprise if we reflect on the extent to which Renaissance and early modern thinkers cognize the world, and especially the so-called New World, through frameworks compounded from ancient Roman and Greek traditions and their biblical hybrids. The New World savage is always haunted by ancient utopians of the Golden Age, or alternatively, or also by these classical figures of barbarism. As Hayden White suggested in a fascinating study of the figure of the wild man that in the Middle Ages precedes the emergence of the figure of the savage in the encounter with the indigenous populations of the America, an essay called The Forms of Wildness. What he sees as taking place in this figure of the savage is what he calls a technique of ostensive self-definition by negation. So the savage is, and before the savage, the wild man, this figure very significant in late medieval lore, is what he calls an antitype. And these are the kind of pre-colonial images of the images of the wild man. From a certain angle, the modern savage could be seen as the illusory realization of this fantastic figure of the wild man, which had menaced and enlivened the real and psychic margins of European cultures in antiquity and the Middle Ages. Did anything uncanny, and part of the point of White's argument is that there was something psychically uncanny about the wild man, this kind of spatialization of one's unconscious. Did anything uncanny remain in the formalization, projection, and spatialization of the pre-colonial wild man onto the native peoples of the Americas? Anything that would confront, to return to that Foucauldian theme, would confront a colonizing rationality with an experience of its limits, rather than with the comfort of just negating other cultures. Now, we might be tempted to single out the idea of the noble savage as such a limit, but such an identification would be mistaken. As numerous scholars, Ter Ellingson, but before him Arthur Lovejoy, Giuliano Liozzi, Michel Duché, and others have detailed, the noble savage is largely a retroactive ideological construction. In the 19th century, broadly pro-imperialist anthropological and philosophical polemics in France as well as in Britain attacked the myth of the noble savage as a kind of proxy for their attacks on incipiently anti-imperialist and indeed socialist thought, for whom, of course, Rousseau served as a kind of bugbear. Ellingson actually shows that it's really a key moment in the 19th centuries within the British Anthropological Society, the consolidation of a sort of racist consensus around the idea that anthropology had entertained this idea of the noble savage. It had to free itself of this idea and actually realize that the indigenous people of the Americas were not worthy of any interest, sympathy, or utopian attractions in order to be properly scientific anthropology. In 19th century, late 19th century French accounts, there's book after book attacking this myth of the noble savage, which was actually never entertained, not least by Rousseau, who never actually used the term noble savage. And it's usually as a proxy, again, for the idea that there are socialists or anarchists or communists who mold their theories on the basis of this false anthropology. As Ellingson writes, there was actually an early formulation of the noble savage, but it had little to do with this supposed romanticism. It was in the early 17th century, again in so-called New France, where the soldier Marc Lescarbot wrote another one of these travel chronicles and narratives in which actually the nobility of the noble savage simply referred to the fact that the indigenous populations were, for him, principally hunters, and nobility was a European category ascribed to those who had the right to hunt. And so that this is in fact a legal term and had nothing utopian about it, because the rest of Lescarbot's writings do not in any sense straightforwardly idealize the indigenous population. So this is what Ellingson says. Rather than an idealized equation of morality with nature, noble savage was a technical concept based on legal theory, attempting to account for the problem of societies that could exist in the absence of anything Europeans might recognize as legal codes and institutions, by projecting a model drawn from European nobility that could satisfactorily account for the absence of a wide range of European-style political and legal constructs. What is misrecognized as a myth of the noble savage is rather the sign, according to Ellingson, as he puts it, of the lingering transformations of the Golden Age discourse, which we encountered in that earlier quote, of comparative negation and the dialectic of vices and virtues. Playing itself out, he continues, in oscillating interaction with the opposing energies and increasingly negativizing forces of Enlightenment, sociocultural, evolutionary progressivism, and 19th century racism. Building on a suggestion by Michel Duché, who's written a fantastic history in France of anthropology's formulations of this figure of the savage, anthropology and philosophy's formulations, we could further argue that to the extent that the reality of the so-called savage world is trapped in this network of negations, it is the very formalism of these negations, so this kind of relentless, monotonous, neither law, nor property, nor the state, nor government, and so on and so forth. It's this formalism which opens them up to a kind of quasi-structuralist play of combination. So you could, you can see different authors prioritizing, as I'll touch on in a second, whether the negation of law is more important than the negation of the state, or whether the negation of property is more important than the negation of certain other features of cultural life. And it's the formalism of these negations which is also behind the seemingly utopian feature, especially, again, in the neither mine nor thine, in the promise of the existence of societies that have no property, but also for libertine European intellectuals also, and this was a massive debate in the 17th and 18th century, the idea that there might actually be atheist societies that have never encountered anything that looks remotely like a European deity. This was part of the fascination and the largely fantastic imagination of what was happening in the Americas. As I will suggest in a moment, it matters to the historical mutation in the figure of the savage which negations take precedence. Which aspect of so-called Western civilization is negated by this figure of the savage. So though you can say this idea that the other negates the self, you can find from ancient Greece all the way to Darwin's travel narratives, the uses and the role that these negations take changes considerably. Is the savage primarily the human without property, or with common possessions, if we want to think of the positive shadowing of these negations, without religion, or with non-monotheistic spiritual practices, without government, or with equality, without industriousness, or with freedom? There's a whole other thing to be dealt with about the obsession with the idea that they do not labor, which, interestingly enough, as Adorno and others point out, is also one of the great obsessions of anti-Semitic imaginations of the Jews as those who do not work. As I have just intimated, the negations can also be inverted in either a critical or utopian guise, namely in the figure of what, over this period, Anthony Pagden has called the savage critic. So this is a whole literary genre where you get almost entirely invented figures who might be Huron or Iroquois generally, and who then voice all of the libertine and subversive fantasies of their libertine, of their European authors. As concerns utopia instead, and as Hayden White has perspicuously noted about the very idea of wildness, in moments of cultural, political, and economic crisis, the antitype, so the savage is the non-self, can become a positive type, or even we could add a kind of prototype. However, rather than a positive valuation of indigenous American societies, this is not wholly absent, for instance, in some of the writings of the missionaries, like Charles Voix, who says, the assemblies of the Iroquois would, be the envy of the greatest Athenian orators, and so on and so forth. So it's not that that doesn't happen, but in the main, it's not a positive nobility, but it is the negativity, the negation of a particular image of the European West that's at stake. By now, I imagine some of you may have already heard echoing in what Ellingson calls these litanies of comparative negations, Blanqui's libertarian communist slogan, ni Dieu ni maître, no gods, no masters. And you can almost find bits of that slogan inside these negations. Now, this negative dialectic of savage dystopia and colonial utopia is present in what is perhaps the most well-known literary instantiation of the savage as comparative negation of the civilized in the Western canon. This is Gonzalo's evocation in Act 2, Scene 1 of Shakespeare's Tempest of the anti-political commonwealth he would impose, had he the chance, on Prospero's island. And this is the passage from Shakespeare, somewhat gratuitously accompanied by an image from Franz Marc of Caliban, so it's not totally gratuitous, it just doesn't add to the argument, except to accompany the quote. In the Commonwealth I would by contraries execute all things, for no kind of traffic would I admit, no name of magistrate. Letters should not be known, riches, poverty, and use of service none. Contract, succession, born, bound of land, tithe, vineyard, none. No use of metal, corn, or wine, or oil. No occupation, all men idle, all. And women too, but innocent and pure. No sovereignty. All things in common nature should produce without sweat or endeavor, treason, felony, sword, pike, knife, gun, or need of any engine. Would I not have, but nature should bring forth of its own kind all foys and all abundance to feed my innocent people. As Shakespeare's scholars began to notice in the late 18th century and continue to discuss to this day, the speech appears as a détournement, or a wholesale borrowing, from Montaigne's Of Cannibals. Though Margaret Hodgin has argued powerfully for the position that if this is indeed the case, then Shakespeare was borrowing the least original aspect of Montaigne, the one that's more or less the same in authors from Strabo and Homer all the way to the present. What is perhaps more telling in Shakespeare is that this is a European's utopia. It's a utopia of the island as a kind of tabula rasa, where one may elide or invert civilization and its discontents. It is not a description of any kind of native or indigenous life. It's certainly not a description of Caliban, who receives, of course, a much more pejorative, but also much more unsettling, and you could argue interesting image than this purely negative list. We are in the presence here, perhaps, of a kind of secondary or imaginary colonization, the one that projects onto so-called savage, colonized lands, spatializing it, a European desire for the negation of their own civilization. A desire which, as Hayden White suggests, inverts the valences of the antitype in moments of cultural crisis. Shakespeare, in some sense, punctures the sureties of this colonial utopian imaginations of Gonzalo's with the interjection of Antonio's great statement of realpolitik. The latter end of this commonwealth forgets its beginning, i.e., your utopia of a stateless society forgets that you colonized it in the first place. So forgets the very imposition of the violence that makes the utopia possible. Gonzalo's withering away of the state in the colonies forgets that the birth of the Commonwealth is indeed a matter of treason, felony, sword, pike, knife, gun, and then some. When the Martinican anti-colonial poet and politician Aimé Césaire adapted Shakespeare's play in his own A Tempest in 1969, the words he put in Gonzalo's mouth also spoke to the limits of his negative and primitivist colonial utopia. This is Gonzalo in Césaire. I mean that if the island is inhabited, as I believe, and if we colonize it, as is my hope, then we have to take every precaution not to import our shortcomings. Yes, what we call civilization. They must stay as they are, savages, noble and good savages, free without any complexes or complications. Something like a pool granting eternal youth where we periodically come to restore our aging, citified souls. It's a really caustic and brutal dredging of what lies behind some of the passage in Shakespeare. I haven't, with this detour, so to speak, forgotten about philosophy or its history, and it seems fitting now to turn to that most fiercely anti-utopian of modern philosophers, Thomas Hobbes. With Hobbes, we can briefly explore how, notwithstanding the seemingly transhistorical, portable character of the savage as antitype, what are seemingly analogous negations can be the bearers of very different philosophical contents and projects. 4 decades after Shakespeare's Tempest, Hobbes's Leviathan depicted the state of nature in the following well-known and by now familiar in terms of its negation forms. In such condition, writes Hobbes famously, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth or tilling, no navigation or use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no letters, and so on and so forth. Modern political philosophy is arguably born of a matrix of negations, juxtaposing an imaginary, at once formalistic and terrifying, of pure privation in the state of nature. So in a sense, the state of nature is just this frightening negation, which is then synonymous, of course, for Hobbes with civil war. And what is juxtaposed to is the imperative necessity of the state, or what Hobbes famously calls that artificial man. And in fact, playing Montaigne against Hobbes, in Hobbes it's the assumption of artificiality which is key. Though Hobbes, who was personally involved in the colonial enterprise as a stockholder of the Virginia Company, spoke of the savages of America, his formulation, sparingly, he did so at crucial points in his work. And as Sergio Landucci forcefully argues, the role of ethnological accounts, and indeed intra-Virginia Company ones, one imagines, of North American forms of life in shoring up or verifying Hobbes' political anthropology should not be underestimated. In fact, homo homini lupus est, famous man as a wolf to man, was after all an expression first used in a colonial travel narrative and not by Hobbes. 2 paragraphs after his famous formulation of the solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, or as a student of a friend of mine once had it in an essay, life is nasty, British, and short. Indeed. 2 paragraphs after that formulation, anticipating the response of a skeptical reader, Hobbes would write, for the savage people in many places of America, this is obviously anticipating, saying, well, of course, the state of nature never existed. On what basis can one make this speculation? For the savage people in many places of America, except the government of small families, the concord whereof dependeth on natural lust, have no government at all, and live at this day in that brutish manner, as I said before. Howsoever may be perceived what manner of life there would be where there were no common power to fear, by the manner of life which men that have formerly lived under peaceful government used to degenerate into a civil war. And it's interesting here too that there's a constant juxtaposition between common power, i.e. the existence of this sovereign artificial form, and common property, or indeed the absence of property. So a very explicit juxtaposition of two forms of the common. A number of elements of Hobbes' use of the savage antitype are worth pausing on. The first is that while Hobbes firmly rejects Aristotle's political anthropology and psychology, and it was Aristotle who was so key in the Spanish juridical and theological debates of the 16th century, especially Aristotle's argument about the natural slavery of colonized peoples, or used to make that argument. So Hobbes rejects that political anthropology, namely by arguing that politics is thoroughly artificial and human beings are not naturally political animals in any way, shape, or form. He does affirm, with Aristotle, an identity between social life and life under an organized, separate political organization, or indeed a state. The state, like property itself, is a thoroughly artificial institution, whereas if we can speak of a natural state among human beings, that will be a state of civil war. Hobbes, whose first important work had been a remarkable translation of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, where armed strife within the city, or stasis, or civil war, is a pervasive theme, would then project the specter of internecine war within the horizon of the European city or state, so the civil war that he himself, of course, was privy to in England, into his selective sampling of travel narratives of the Americans. And that is, of course, the weirdest projection of Hobbes, who, for whom the civil wars, which of course are entirely within the horizon of states and sovereigns that already exist, are imagined as the situation that is experienced by the so-called savages of America. Depicted, and their life depicted as one of permanent warfare and insecurity, which is of course an incessant theme in Hobbes, and it's permanent warfare and insecurity, which of course explain that obsession of colonial accounts, which is the inhibition of production and property. We may note, parenthetically, that perhaps Hobbes' fearsome images of North American warfare were more a function of the frightened reports of anti-colonial resistance, namely in the so-called Jamestown Massacre of 1622, than any account of practices of warfare among indigenous people. Though he certainly situated him on an inferior rung in the hierarchy of the civilized arts, Hobbes, like his 17th century rationalist contemporaries, including Descartes, maintained an ultimately homogeneous and paradoxically egalitarian philosophical anthropology. There are neither for Hobbes nor Descartes are there anything as natural, racial, or biological differences. Social and political differences were for Hobbes necessary and salutary, but they were not natural. In fact, that's why they were to be promoted. This also involved positing that in the contemporary savage condition, one could read the past of European countries themselves. Johannes Fabian, in a famous critique of anthropology called Time and the Other, talked about this as allochrony, so the idea that the other, or allos, lives in another time. This is, of course, a theme that recurs in so much of this colonial writing, the idea of the savage as a kind of living fossil and mirror of the past of Europe. Pierre Clastres has identified this quite powerfully as the ancient Western conviction that history is a one-way street. The societies without power are the image of what we have ceased to be, and that for them, our culture is the image of what they have to become. And that's, in a sense, what the allochrony notion does in Fabian. This theme, which was later crystallized in Locke's famous or infamous dictum, "In the beginning, the whole world was America," makes an important appearance in Hobbes' 1642 Elements of Law, where Hobbes writes that, quote, "the experience of savage nation that live at this day, and by the histories of our ancestors, the old inhabitants of Germany and other now civil countries, where we find the people few and short-lived, and without the ornaments and comforts of life." This European introjection of the savage, so the idea that we once were savages, so to speak, is the formulation, is iconographically evident in the frontispiece of Hobbes's famous De Cive, or The Citizen, where we have, as you can see, well, it's a bit distant, you can see it's religion on top, which is divided in the middle with imperium on the one side, and behind the figure of sovereignty are tilled and cultivated fields and peace and so on. But on the other side is not savagery, it's freedom, intriguingly enough. And this is then the figure, and you can see these rather rough drawings of supposed endless strife amongst, prototypically naked figures and so on and so forth. But it's interesting, this is a figure of freedom. It's not a, so the choice, your choice is imperium or libertas. Now, the European interjection of savagery is also evident in the fact that this image quotes, in many ways, another set of images. These were Theodore de Bry's, is an engraver that did a lot of the engravings of these first encounters of North America. There's a Thomas Harriot's Brief and True Report of the Newfound Land of Virginia from 1588, so about 60 years before Hobbes, and you can see almost the same exact rough drawn bow and arrow wielding figures in the back. Now, what's curious actually about de Bry's illustrations to Thomas Harriot's book is that he decided to include in these illustrations 6 images, not of so-called Virginian savages, but of Picts, the apparently barbarian original inhabitants of the British Isles, which in fact are much more horrific and gory and grisly, as you can see with the beheading and the tattooed knees and so on and so forth, than the images of the Virginians. And that was part of an argument to which Hobbes participated, which involved undermining the notion of a noble genealogy of British society and involved this supposedly dispassionate realpolitik recognition that the force and order of sovereignty lay on a very thin historical ground, and that the condition of civil war was indeed the universal one. At a more theoretical level, attention to Hobbes's use of the savage antitype instructs us that, contrary to being an ethnocentric invariant across Western history, it shifted in historically significant ways, and that these shifts were articulated, at least in part, in terms of a hierarchy of negations. In other words, though Hobbes's list largely matches those of Montaigne, and indeed echoes the ancient and medieval examples given by Hodgen, one negation reigns supreme: the negation of the state. It is from this, in Hobbes, from the negation of the state or the negation of sovereignty, that the savage absence of, indeed from the savage absence of sovereign government, that everything else follows. It's because there is no state that there are no laws, because there is no state that there is no property, because there is no state that there is no security, agricultural development, productive labor, the arts, and so on. This is interestingly contrasted with the hierarchy of negations in Locke, for whom it's because there is no property and because there is no productive economy that there is no state, quite explicitly. This recombination of comparative negations shows us a shift from the problem of political order and of civil war, Hobbes's problem, to the problem of productive development. And in a sense, then Locke becomes crucial for establishing a mutation in the figure of the savage, which goes from the speculative negation of civilization to a stage in a theory of history and in a periodization of history, such as one will famously encounter first in Montesquieu and then in the Scottish Enlightenment itself. This paradigm, grounded in Locke's ideology of property and contradictorily presaged in Rousseau's anthropological speculations, will be fundamental to the development of classical political economy and its own philosophical anthropology, above all in the Scottish Enlightenment, from Robertson, History of America, to Adam Smith's writings on law, history, and economics. For Landucci, in his book, this is, in a sense, a progress. And Landucci, like Ronald Meek's Social Science and the Ignoble Savage, also a book written in the 1970s, really presents the Scottish Enlightenment and its own use of the savage as a kind of precursor to the theory of history, of historical materialism, and indeed the theory of history of Marx. That might be a source of perhaps an imminent critique of Marxism's own tendencies to periodization or civilizational narratives, but I think it's hard to countenance as, for some reason, a kind of progression over necessarily the Hobbesian or Lockean accounts. Now, to conclude, if we abandon the prejudice whereby historicism, even if laced with the propertied ideologies of racial capitalism, is to be preferred to rationalism or skepticism, which seems to be Landucci's argument, that somehow Montaigne and Hobbes, because they remained within this world of formalistic negation, couldn't produce a real social theory, and even though it was part of a form of thinking that included this racial imaginary, nevertheless, the stagist theory of history of the Scottish Enlightenment was a progress. Even if we don't take this position, we can nevertheless draw an important lesson, I think, from Landucci's text, where he identifies, and this is what I want to end on, the key turning point in the history of European philosophy's conceptualization of the savage, in the thesis, which was grounded above all in the responses to missionary travel narratives coming from New France or Canada, that there can be societies without a state. So Landucci makes this very crucial argument that there's a key moment in the early 18th century where the Hobbesian primacy of the state and Hobbes's notion, which totally determines his notion of the savage or of the state of nature, that society is impossible without a state, shifts into a whole set of arguments where people are turning to these travel narratives, mainly by Jesuit missionaries, and saying, what they can prove is that societies can exist without a state, or that politics is not, or that a social existence is not coterminous with existence under a state. The sharpest statement, and it's a curious source of this anti-Hobbesian argument, which seeks to counter an identification of social life with governed life established in Europe from Aristotle's Zoon Politikon onwards, is to be found in a text by the German philosopher Leibniz from 1711. So Leibniz, who in fact met him and was on rather friendly terms with him, is responding to a kind of paradigmatic example of the savage critic narrative, which is the Baron de Laontan's dialogues between a philosopher and a savage. In Baron de Laontan's other book, The New Voyages in Northern America, has this frontispiece, which says, he will, et legis sceptra territ, so he will crush laws and scepters, law and sovereignty. That is this, a paradigmatic figure. Leibniz, writing a letter to one of his correspondents, Bierling, they both came to know Laontan, he writes the following. He says, the Iroquois and the Huron have reversed the excessively universal political maxims of Aristotle and Hobbes. They have shown that entire peoples can live without magistrates and without quarrels. But the rudeness of these savages shows that it is not so much necessity, but the inclination to go towards the good and approach happiness by mutual assistance that is the foundation of societies and states. A year earlier, in a letter also engaging with his reading of Laontan, Leibniz had subverted the logic of comparative negation even more thoroughly, writing that it is entirely truthful that the Americans of these regions live together without any government but in peace. They know no fights, nor hatreds, nor battles, or not many, except against men of different nations and languages. I would almost say that we are dealing with a political miracle unknown by Aristotle and ignored by Hobbes. Whatever the truthfulness of such claims, especially because they were based on an entirely fictional dialogue by Laontan, it is striking that Leibniz's mention of a political miracle opens up a possibility distant from the vast majority of the European political and philosophical imagination, and to the responses to the encounter with the indigenous populations of the Americas. Namely, that rather than a negation of Europe and its notions of the political, a negation which might be utopian or ironic or skeptical, but which nevertheless is entirely drawn from within the imaginary repertoire of Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian sources, the encounter with North American societies may require thinking of a different, unprecedented politics. As many commentators have detailed, the colonial encounter with the indigenous populations of the Americas was one marked in the intellectual sphere by the assimilation of models, myths, conceptual imaginaries, and formal taxonomies that populated the European mind during this period. An encounter in which comparativism was laced with the violence of an imperialist instrumental rationality. In this sense, the idea of the savage largely served as a screen on which to project the reflection of a Europe racked by the emergence of capitalism and its contradictions, as well as by the crisis of Christian political theology. The savage was a kind of inverted mirror in which European intellectuals could pose the enigmas of the age. What is politics? What is law? What is religion? What is property? Very rarely was there a sense, as in Leibniz's Political Miracle, that the people of the Americas could force Europe to dislocate or expatriate its political philosophy. In a sense, European intellectual life would have to wait until the second half of the 20th century for the emergence of radical trends in anthropology to unfold the kind of miracle whereof Leibniz spoke. Pierre Clastres' Society Against the State, for instance, could be read as an extended elaboration of the anti-Aristotelian and anti-Hobbesian effects of the encounter with Amerindian people glimpsed by Leibniz. From his fieldwork among the Guayaki Indians in Paraguay, as in the evidence of so much anthropological work across the Americas, Clastres would draw a drastic challenge to the political anthropology of the West, namely in the ubiquity in both North and South America of societies where political power was not synonymous with the dialectic of obedience and command, with the monopolization of violence and the separation of a political or sovereign sphere. Clastres would even go so far as portraying Amerindian forms of chiefdom as collective stratagems to prevent the emergence of politics as sovereign domination. As he commented, and I wanted to just end on this quote, so we can have some time for questions. One is confronted then, says Clastres, in this essay, Copernicus and the Savages, where Copernicus is really speaking of a Copernican revolution or a radical turn in political anthropology. One is confronted then, he says, by a vast constellation of societies in which the holders of what elsewhere could be called power are actually without power, where the political is determined as a domain beyond coercion and violence, beyond hierarchical subordination, where, in a word, no relationship of command obedience is enforced. This, says Clastres, is the major difference of the Indian world. Thanks.
That was a fascinating survey. One text that I didn't hear you discuss, which I'm curious to know your opinion on, is Diderot's Supplément au Voyage de Bougainville. How do you see that fitting into the picture?
This is where my erudition runs short. So perhaps you could say.
Well, this is it's a text,
I mean, I'm aware of the text, but it's not something.
It's a dialogue between a European priest and a native, in which the native gets the better of the priest. He demonstrates that God does not exist and proves that marriage and slavery and colonialism are all forms of ownership of people that violate the natural law. And at the end, Diderot, the personage who's supposed to be recounting this, and his friend decide that perhaps they can't restore this condition, natural condition, but they can reform laws that are against nature. So this text was not published in Diderot's lifetime. He was afraid to publish it. He'd already spent some time in the Bastille, didn't want to resume that. But it was published after his death by a right-wing priest to prove just how immoral the Enlightenment was. So,
I mean, one thing that I might say about that, not about the text directly, involves something I didn't manage to get to, which is a critique that in a book that comes out 6 years after the Landucci's book on Philosophers of the Savages, another Italian historian of ideas, Giuliano Liozzi, writes this book called Adam and the New World. And he praises Landucci for establishing this very thorough survey of the material, but says, well, one of the things that's very curious well, one of the things that makes approaching this question of the savage through the history of ideas very problematic is that, in fact, and it's of course the problem also of what I've been speaking about tonight, is the fact that it remains within this speculative, which is to say also mirroring relationship where European writers and philosophers create either this formally negative figure or this dramatic persona, the savage philosopher, the savage critic, in order to remain within a dialogue internal to the debate. So whereby the point of Dario and La Hontan or the figure in the Diderot dialogue that you're talking about is one of undermining a particular kind of status quo, but it's not, what's not at stake, and Yotzi's quite right about what's not at stake directly, but is at stake indirectly, is the colonial relation itself, the encounter in a sense. How is it at stake? Yotzi makes this point actually about Montaigne. He says, well, everybody reads, most people read Montaigne. Critic of colonialism, so on and so forth. And says, actually, well, if you look at the context of Montaigne's writing, if you look at the context of especially the Huguenot intellectuals with whom he was in dialogue in the late 16th century, one of their main forms of critiques of colonialism is a critique of Spanish colonialism. And the point of criticizing Spanish colonialism is to support the benevolence of French, by then very embryonic forms of French colonialism. That, in that sense, it's problematic, as methodologically a historian of ideas like Landucci does, to treat the shift in this figure of the savage without concurrently, not in a deterministic way, but without concurrently treating the shifting conjunctures that are at stake in this colonial relation. And a lot of them have to do with the ways in which different organic intellectuals, for want of a better word, relate to the colonial project at a particular time. And often the figure of the savage critic is not there to really make anything that would resemble an anti-colonial argument. It's to make an argument against bad or vicious forms of colonialism. And the quantity of texts which focus on, very explicitly on the genocidal character of Spanish conquest, but which are not necessarily followed by some strict undermining of the project, are quite legion. So that's just an occasion to say what also might be the limits of this, because it's remaining within the idea that the savage is a mirror or a negative persona within a debate which is more about religion in Europe or sovereignty in Europe than it is really in any developed sense about the colonial relation and its limits.
Shall we?
I have a question.
I'll pass the mic back, please. For the film.
Thank you. So in this logic of comparative negation that you've brought up several times as the sort of leitmotif of your lecture, that Hobbes and Locke and various other writers share, even though they reverse the sort of ultimate impact of the logic of comparative negation, no God, no faith, no law, Isn't there something about that logic that augurs what Agamben calls, in his description of the 19th century, this man without content? Because Hobbes and Locke effectively disagree, but in their disagreement, they maintain that palimpsest of the settler-colonial relation, which is that it doesn't matter what the conclusion of the logic of comparative negation is. All that matters is that there be comparative negation. And that becomes a kind of empty grid that gets sort of projected. And I wonder, but you've done a lovely genealogy of tracing the permutations in this logic of comparative negation. But do you have any proposal for what motivates this absence and difference.
What motivates at what
The logic
level?
of comparative negation seems to be ultimately a logic of absence and difference.
Yeah.
So Hobbes and Locke can disagree, but their disagreement doesn't have any gravitas because the superiority of the colonial figure is maintained.
Well,
There's no content.
right. Well, I mean, there is a, I mean, so there is a content in the sense that, in the sense that sometimes, as in the case of, so in the case of Hobbes, that logic is at its most minimal, to the extent that there's almost a reluctance. It's almost as if Hobbes, who, you know, being a stockholder and participant in the meetings of the Virginia Company, knew quite a lot, you know, in these accounts like Thomas Harrod, et cetera, had been around. His, the role of this figure is to anchor a comparative negation that Hobbes has generalized to his own society, interestingly enough, because he's not particularly interested in the you know, to the very predicament of civil war within the English context, and then it anchors it at its most minimal level, as if to say, just purely indicate there, you know, there is, this exists empirically, but it's both important that I say so in terms of what's objected to me, and it's entirely insignificant to my argument what exactly these forms of life or society or war, etc., might be. In the case of Locke, because the focus is on the nexus of economy and law primarily as prior or determinant of the political sphere, this is an argument which is much more, also in its positive in the sense of prescriptive dimensions, much more significant because it is actually paradigmatic of a particular understanding of the logics of appropriation of settler colonialism, which in Hobbes is not, you know, in Hobbes, in a sense, the brute force of conquest is legitimate enough, partly because of his conception of sovereignty. So one of the things that shifts within this matrix is how it enters into what we could call like certain kind of logics of legitimation. But then after Locke, where it does have this more, you know, juridical economic element, that then it also shifts and creates the basis for the narratives of progress and improvement that's supposedly more empirical because more richly descriptive accounts of the lives of indigenous people present. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do by using kind of Landucci's argument partly against them is to say, well, in a sense to echo what you're saying, is that because that logic remains, even when it is filled out with all of this kind of descriptive material, much of the descriptive material being there for the purposes of colonial governance, not for, you know, dispassionate anthropological study or what have you. Because it's in place, then it does, the comparativist violence comes along with it. Now, one of the things that is telling is also what happens a little later, so well, beginning in the late 18th century, but into the 19th, is that logic of comparative negation, which was a negation of these formal dimensions of the Western polity, law, property, et cetera, that negativity becomes quite explicitly biologized, which is not something I'm talking about at all. So actually, the strongest attacks on all of on the narratives of the noble savage are the narratives saying, no, it's not that in the beginning the whole world was America, because America is just a land of either immaturity or degeneration, and they can never decide which. But where the negativity is a negativity of a different, it's still a violently negative sign, but it's not a logic of comparison. So Buffon already in the 1770s, but later on, all of the racist anthropology of the 19th century will instead, very contrary of Leibniz, like this is not even a society. There's not even anything here. So it doesn't even reach the level of being the negation of the West. And that's, well, and one of the interesting things about what Ellingson and Yotzi and others say about the myth of the noble savage is the fact that there is something unsettling in the logic of comparative negation, which you can see from Peter Martyr on, is the moment, the unsettled, semi-utopian energies that enter into the negativity. You go, they live in common, or no such mischief as money, and so on and so forth. And it's almost as if that has to be, even though of course it's in a total colonial and imperial mindset, but even that has to be evacuated. So in these biologized narratives of the 19th century, the formalism, even the formalism of the negativity has to be removed, and the negativity just becomes degeneracy, which is actually the term that occupies it. And there's another book which is actually translated into English called The Dispute of the New World, a book written in the 1950s by a sort of erudite Jewish-Italian banker who had ended up in Peru for 10 years fleeing fascism, and wrote this whole book about the history from the mid-1700s onwards of the idea that the New World was either immature or decadent. And in that book you see, including actually in Hegel's philosophy of history, where this becomes very significant as well, this notion of an immature, materially immature or decayed. And so all of the utopian dimensions that sneaked into this colonial matrix then also need to be expelled. And that's when the myth that Europe was dominated by this sympathy for indigenous people is played out.
Maybe one down here.
Thank you so much. I was trying to find out, besides how we're very interesting, this genealogical investigation of how this whole thing as a problematics was invented. But I was trying to work out to find out what is the relevance of your talk basically to the contemporary presence, other than. I was trying to find out are you trying to approach or reapproach the question of savage in a contemporary fashion as a way of creating a generic term, a generic other, or don't you find it problematic framing it within the paradigm of savage versus the savage as the other versus a self, especially in an era that identity is really functioning like a monster, what Alain Badiou would say, identity is nothing but me, myself, at a distance, as all one word, or Althusser once was saying everything that becomes a metaphor, savage as a metaphor of anti-state, anti-sovereignty. Once we were all dealing with that Bayesian superstructure metaphor for ages. Once Althusser was saying that the most important thing we need to remember about Bayesian superstructure metaphor is that it is a metaphor. So I heard the talk, it sounds fantastic, but I didn't hear that you're addressing that, hey, watch out, the savage yet is not really a metaphor. It can be a generic other, not a general other. So the distinction between the generic and the general didn't seem to be really having a place with readdressing a super important historical philosophical question as savage. So I was wondering if you want to say anything about that.
Well, maybe just to go back just briefly to what I started with. So I guess the issue is the extent to which we can establish a kind of, the extent to which these kind of archaeological, genealogical exercises might be helpful in elucidating different figures of otherness and alterity at a quite formal level, perhaps, that to one extent endure or do not. And I think that on one level, the formalistic character of a kind of generically ethnocentric way of thinking, one could even argue perhaps that, that is at such a general level, I mean, as the Hodgin was arguing as well, that, you can find in ancient Rome, there's nothing specifically colonial or imperialist about the other is the negation of the self type of argument. So that formalism has a kind of invariance. What I wanted to argue, and I, to be honest, I haven't really thought through the extent to which that pattern and recombination of negations might be found in the present. But what I did want to argue is that one of the things that happens with the inception of well, with the entrance of philosophy into colonialism and colonialism into philosophy, or however you want to put it, is that the debates circle around this hierarchy, including what I also didn't talk about, the idea of whether the absence of religion, the absence or presence of religion might have the determinant role. Now, we could see that as something that then occupies the continued work of both political philosophy and anthropology in different ways. And we could perhaps identify that the other aspect of it, which I do think is worth reflecting on, is to what extent is our utopian imaginary, and this is not so, wasn't so prominent perhaps, but to what extent is our utopian imaginary formalistic in that sense? To what extent is the imaginary of a society without property, despite itself perhaps, just the repetition of that formalism that was so key to philosophy's encounter or misencounter or misrecognition, to use Balibar's terms, of the so-called savage, or whether, and that was, hence the opening to classical, because I do think that's a more interesting avenue of thinking, well, if one moves beyond the negation, what is this, and it's society against the state, not society without the state, and that's a key element. So there's an actual different articulation of what political power is that Clastres is getting at, and without arguing whether that's correct or not, that I think that's why I wanted to end with the link between Leibniz and Clastres, because I think that takes the discussion out of the endless repetition of the negations, or the way in which the negations get mobilized into a narrative of development, where the negative is just which was arrested or backward or earlier or whatever, into a very different kind of opposition. And I think both a more political and a more dialectical opposition, one could argue, which is, for instance, Clastres' distinction between a politics that has command obedience as its primary nexus and a politics in which power has a very different articulation. That might be too monolithic a way of thinking it, but I do think it's a way of exiting, let's say, the narrative that I presented whilst following, at least one of its threads, which was Leibniz's critique of Aristotle and Hobbes.
Great. Thank you. Before I ask you to join me in thanking Alberto one more time, two quick things. One is you mentioned Détournement. There's a rock off Stanley Park called Siwash Rock, which is actually a Coast Salish or Squamish détournement of the French word sauvage, Siwash. The second thing is more to today and to this evening is to also invite everyone in this room to Jaleh Mansour's book launch happening about 20 minutes down at the SFU Woodwards, another one of our campuses. But please now join me in thanking Alberto for his wonderful talk.